Ai auzit de argumentul Kalam pentru Existența lui Dumnezeu? Un mare filozof, jurist și teolog islamic pe numele Al-Ghazali a formulat următorul argument. Tot ce începe să existe are o cauză. Universul a început să existe. Prin urmare, Universul are o cauză. Directorul global al misiunii Resonable Faith, Tyson James, va explica argumentul Kalam ca argument pentru existența lui Dumnezeu.
Bună! I'm Tyson James, the Global Chapter's Director for Resonable Faith. Thank you so much for joining us. Most of us have wondered at some point whether the universe is eternal or had a beginning, or, if it had a beginning, what caused it to begin? These are actually some of the oldest questions in philosophy, with many different arguments being formulated on both sides. Today, I'd like to share what many consider to be one of the most powerful arguments for the existence of God, the Kalam cosmological argument. The argument was first formulated by a medieval Muslim theologian named Al-Ghazali in the 12th century. It is very simple and easy to memorize, having only two premises and a conclusion. Number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist. Number three, the conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. This is a deductive argument, which means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows necessarily. A good argument has premises which are more probably true than false. So let's take a look at each of them and see whether or not they are well supported. Premise 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. For anyone sincerely interested in the truth, this premise is virtually undeniable. Many philosophers consider this to be one of the starting points for rational discussion on the topic. To say that this premise is false is to say that something can come into being without any cause at all. But this seems impossible, and there are three good reasons to think that the first premise is actually true. Number one, something cannot come from nothing. The very concept of nothing is an absence of anything, including powers and properties. As such, nothing cannot cause anything, much less the creation of the universe. Some have tried to deny this point by appealing to modern physics, saying that subatomic particles come into being from nothing. However, this is not at all what the science tells us. Rather, according to modern physics, subatomic particles come from a fluctuation of energy contained in a vacuum. But there is no sense in which this vacuum is nothing. The vacuum is a sea of fluctuating energy that behaves according to physical laws and has a physical structure. In other words, subatomic particles actually provide evidence for the claim that something cannot come from nothing. Number two, if something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why anything and everything doesn't come into being from nothing. If the universe came into being out of nothing, then why not galaxies, or tennis courts, or one of my favorite tennis players, Simona Halep? Why is it that only universes come into being from nothingness? As I said, nothingness doesn't have any powers or properties, so there can't be anything about nothingness which favors universes. Some atheists have tried to respond by saying that premise 1 is true of everything in the universe, but not of the universe itself. But this stopping point seems completely arbitrary. The causal premise is a metaphysical principle that applies to everything which begins to exist, including the universe. This attempt by the atheist to dismiss the causal principle only at the level of universes is simply a desperate attempt to avoid a conclusion that has theological implications. When challenged, some atheists have responded, well, if everything has a cause, then what caused God? But this, of course, is not what premise 1 says. Rather, it says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. God is eternal and uncaused, and so did not begin to exist. And we aren't making an exception to the causal principle for God. God simply doesn't require a cause because he never began to exist. In fact, this is typically what many atheists throughout history have claimed about the universe itself, that it was eternal and therefore did not need a cause. The problem, though, is that we now have very good evidence that the universe is not eternal, and so the atheist must confront the problem of the universe as having an absolute beginning. The third argument in support of the first premise is that common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1. In our everyday experience, the first premise is constantly verified and never falsified. We simply never encounter examples of things beginning to exist without a cause. Given these 3 points, it seems almost undeniable that the first premise is true. But what about the second premise? The universe began to exist. This is generally the premise most opponents of the argument attack. There are 4 arguments given to support it, 2 philosophical and 2 scientific. The first argument, an actually infinite number of things cannot exist. Here we need to distinguish between a potential infinity and an actual infinity. A potential infinity is one which continually approaches an ideal limit but never reaches it, like the mathematical concept of an asymptote. An actual infinity is one in which the number of members is larger than any finite number. If the number of the universe's past moments is actually infinite, then it never began to exist. However, we have good reason to think an actually infinite number of things is impossible. When you try to use subtraction with actually infinite sets, you get contradictory answers. For example, if you subtract all of the odd numbers from infinity, you still have infinity, all of the infinite even numbers. But if you subtract another infinity, for example, all of the natural numbers greater than 3, then you get a finite number, 3. It is this absurdity of contradictory answers which leads many philosophers and mathematicians to reject the possibility of an actually infinite number of things. And if an actually infinite number of things is impossible, then so is an actually infinite number of past moments. The second philosophical argument is similar to the first. It claims that it is impossible to create an infinite collection by successive addition. As children, we all probably tried to count to infinity and realized that it is impossible. We can always add one more number, right? The same is true of counting down the negative numbers. Now, if we imagine time as a number line with the present moment at 0 and the negative numbers representing past moments, we will see that we can never arrive at an actually infinite number of past moments. What this means is that if the universe is eternal in the past, then it would be impossible to arrive at the present moment. Number 3 is the first scientific argument, and it is based on the expansion of the universe. In the 1920s, Alexander Friedman and Georges Lemaitre came up with a model of the universe which suggested that the universe was expanding, and this would later be known as the Big Bang Theory, and is now known as the Standard Model. In 1929, Edwin Hubble, the namesake of the Hubble telescope, discovered the redshift, which was the observation that the light from distant galaxies was redder than expected. But this is exactly what one would expect if the universe was in fact expanding. Why is this relevant? Well, if you look back in time, the universe continually contracts until the space between 2 points is 0. This is the boundary of space and time. Thus, the standard Big Bang model predicts an absolute beginning of the universe. The strong evidence for the Standard Model came in 1965 with the discovery of a cosmic background of microwave radiation, which was yet another major prediction of that model. Many have tried to find a way around this model, but everything we've found in the last 100 years has confirmed it. Finally, in 2003, three leading scientists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, were able to prove that any universe that has, on average, been expanding throughout its history must have had an absolute beginning. The theorem was actually so strong that Vilenkin said this: "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." Number 4, the thermodynamics of the universe. According to the second law of thermodynamics, a system will become increasingly disorderly unless energy is brought into it from outside. It's because of this law that our hot coffee gets colder and our cold drinks get warmer. Since the 19th century, scientists have realized that when we apply this law to the universe as a whole, given enough time, the energy will spread itself out so much that none of it will be usable. Eventually, life will not be possible because there will be no usable energy. This is called the heat death of the universe. But this leads us to wonder why we're not already in a state of heat death. If the universe is eternal in the past, then it should have already run out of usable energy. But obviously, we do still have usable energy. What this means is that the current state of thermodynamics is evidence that the universe is not past eternal. Over the last few decades, dozens of models have been proposed which seek to avoid an absolute beginning of the universe, but these have all been shown to either lead to absurdities, have failed to gain empirical support, or have been proven wrong by modern observations. In a much different attempt to avoid the theological implications of the argument's conclusion, atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett admits that the universe does have a cause, but that the cause of the universe is itself. But this view is absolute nonsense. Self-causation is impossible because in order for the universe to create itself, it would have to already exist. In other words, it would have to exist before it existed. As you can see, this view is logically incoherent. So we have seen that both premises of the argument are well supported, which means that it is intellectually responsible to accept the argument's conclusion that the universe has a cause. It is in the analysis of what it means to be a cause of the universe that we see God appear. For since the universe is time, space, matter, and energy, the cause must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and incredibly powerful to be able to bring the universe into being from nothing. There is also good reason to think that this cause is personal. If the cause was always producing the effect, then the effect would be as eternal as the cause. But time began at the creation of the universe. So what explains a timeless cause bringing about a temporal effect? The answer is free will. A being with free will can spontaneously bring about an effect independent of any prior conditions. Therefore, the universe doesn't just have a cause, but a personal creator. In other words, God. I look forward to your questions. Mulțumesc foarte mult.
Okay, Tyson. I don't know if you want to say something before we get into the
questions and answers. I saw that's already one question already. So I don't know if you want to say something before.
Yeah, so first of all, just thank you all for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. I've never spoken to a group in Romania before, so this is a first for me. Yeah, so let's go ahead and take some questions. It looks like the first question is, if reason is a phenomenon internal to the universe, how can one construct a rational argument about the universe? Or should we understand that reason is larger than the universe? So this is a very good question. First, I think we need to recognize that reason is something that minds do. But clearly, certain things were reasonable before humans existed. So it follows, or at least seems reasonable, that humans were not the cause of reason. And so since there were no reasoning minds during the first, billions of years of the universe, then you might even have an argument that if there were reasonable things before humans, that reason must come from prior or some ground before the universe. Yeah, so I would just note that some philosophers have noted that reason gives us good, we are able to use reason in an argument for God's existence because certain things were reasonable before humans existed.
There is a follow-up question for this, Dan?
So what I understand is that reason is finally larger than the universe.
Deci să înțeleg că rațiunea e cumva mai mare decât universul?
Yes, so let's take the Kalam cosmological argument. The first premise says whatever begins to exist has a cause. And this would seem to apply to anything at all that exists and has a beginning. And we don't assume in the premise that the universe is the only thing that exists. If we did assume that the universe is the only thing existing, then we would be begging the question in favor of atheism.
Următoarea întrebare este, putem argumenta existența lui Dumnezeu prin manifestarea credinței?
The next question is, can we argue the existence of God by manifestation of the faith?
Maybe they can explain what they mean by the manifestation of faith.
Credința trăită, pur și simplu, credința în Dumnezeu, simplificând lucrurile.
So here I want to make a careful distinction. I think that we can know that God exists without arguments like the one that I presented today. The Bible says that the Spirit witnesses to our spirits. And so we can know God by a direct experience with God. But when we want to show that God exists, we need arguments and evidence. So if I tell someone that I have faith in God because I have experienced God, I may be telling the truth, but the other person does not have access to my mental or spiritual experience. And so that's why I think arguments like the one I presented today are very useful in showing people that God exists, because they're based on observations that are open to anyone.
Altă întrebare, deschideți microfonul, cred că e mai ușor decât să scrieți.
Sau dacă există o relație între argument și dovadă.
Yes, so in normal language, by proof, we mean something that is so strong that it is compelling. You cannot deny it. So we might say that something like a mathematical equation would be proof. It's very strong. But we wouldn't claim that this argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, is strong in the sense of a mathematical proof. For arguments for the existence of God, for it to be a good argument, the premises should be more plausible than their negations. This brings up another point, that a lot of people require certainty in order to say that God exists. But we do believe that we know things without having absolute certainty. And so I think it's perfectly legitimate and responsible to say that we believe in God, even if we don't have absolute certainty.
Prin urmare, ar fi argumentul ceva solid, iar dovada ar fi credința.
Right. A good argument, premises that are more plausible than their negations, but it falls short of compelling belief. And faith just means trust. So you can have blind faith, which is not based on any reason. And so I believe this argument helps us to have a more reasonable faith.
Mai avem o întrebare. We have another question from the same person. Unbelief cannot be changed just by argument, or does it require a will?
I think arguments are a good tool for overcoming unbelief. On our website, we have testimonials of people who have been convinced by these arguments.
Dan Tămuleț a pus întrebarea:
Does causality mean the same thing within the universe as it means outside the universe, between God and the universe? If yes, would not that insert God into the universe? First, philosophers have always recognized different types of causality. For example, Aristotle noted the difference between material causation and efficient causation. And so, since the universe is all matter, the cause of the universe must transcend matter. So what that leaves us with is an efficient cause. On atheism, there is no thing other than the universe. And so there is neither a material cause nor an efficient cause. So at least with theism, there is a cause of the universe. On atheism, there is no cause.
Hey, Tyson, can you make a distinction between the cosmological argument and telelogical argument?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes, so the cosmological argument seeks to prove the existence of God based on the beginning of the universe. The teleological argument seeks to show God's existence based on a particular feature of the universe. That specific feature being a specified complexity which natural causes don't seem capable of bringing about.
Any questions?
So I'll just, maybe I can add a little to the discussion for clarity too.
Thank you.
So you may notice that the conclusion does not imply specifically the Christian God. This is because the argument is only meant to prove a generic monotheism. So this is compatible with any monotheistic religion. The way we get to specifically the Christian God is through Christian evidences like the resurrection. It also doesn't conclude to any moral attributes of God. For that, we would appeal to the moral argument.
Can you explain the concept of infinity?
Poți explica conceptul infinității?
Yes, so there are different ways that we use the word infinity, and we have to be very careful because if not, we can cause confusion. So Christians often say that God is infinite, but we said in the argument that an actual infinity is impossible. So if an actual infinity is impossible, then it seems like God is impossible. So what we need to clarify is that when we speak of God, we're speaking of a qualitative, not a quantitative infinity. So God is infinite in the sense that he has his attributes to their greatest degree. Not that he is quantitatively infinite, like he has an infinite number of spiritual parts or something.
There's another question. How can we define God?
Yeah, so there are two ways that we can define God. We can define it as a maximally great being, or we can define it as the being that answers to omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. And in that way, people can understand what we mean when we say God. That's a very good question, because a lot of people think that by defining God, we are limiting him in some way. But that's not necessary. Just by defining God, we are clarifying what it is that we're talking about.
So I'm going to ask you a question to help out my fellow brothers. So the Kalam first argument talks about whatever begins to exist has a cause. So you know that there are people that ask, okay, so who made God?
The first premise does not say that everything that begins to exist has a cause. If we did make that claim, then we would be stuck in an infinite regress, because for every cause, there would be another cause, and we would never end that causal chain. There have been philosophers like Andrew Locke who have done work on causal finitism.
You have another question, Laurencio.
Mm-hmm. How can I persuade a person that says he is content with being agnostic, not having the desire to know everything? This is a very serious problem. We struggle to convince people who are apathetic towards the existence of God. What we do is try to illustrate to them that God's existence is necessary for true meaning, value, and purpose in life. So if they want to be both happy and have a meaningful life, then they would be served by believing in God. But I found it very difficult to convince people who are apathetic that this is an important topic. Oftentimes, it takes a very serious life event to make people think seriously about this subject.
Călin a pus întrebarea în timp ce dădeam răspunsul la întrebarea lui Laurențiu Trică, să definim termenul de agnostic.
There are a couple of ways to define agnostic. The word itself, the root, means not knowing. So that could mean that we just don't have any good reasons for or against, and so we reserve judgment. Or it could mean that given the concept of God, we cannot know whether he exists. So the first definition, reserving judgment, this is why the arguments are important, because it's very difficult to be agnostic if you are presented arguments for or against. For the second definition, this is why work on the coherence of theism is important. Because if the concept of theism is coherent, then we have some knowledge, or we can have knowledge of God.
There was another question. Can you talk about the substantiality of God?
So the idea of a substance is something that has properties. So physical substances have physical properties. But there are also spiritual substances that have spiritual properties. we ourselves have a spiritual component. That might include properties like being a moral agent or a reasoning agent. So we shouldn't think of substance as just a physical object. And that might lead to another question of how we know that we have an immaterial component. And there we would point to arguments like our identity over time. Our physical bodies do not stay identical over time. For example, our brains are gaining and losing atoms all the time. And eventually they could have all of their atoms completely replaced. But it seems that we would still be the same people. And so that could provide evidence that our identity is not because of our bodies.
Următoarea întrebare este tot de la Dan Tomuleț, care spune că unii spun că Dumnezeu este mai presus de rațiune. Cum puteți comenta acest lucru?
So this would be very strange. We believe that God is the source of truth. If God is above reason, then the laws of logic do not apply to him. And if the laws of logic do not apply to him, then we could say that God both exists and does not exist, which is absurd. If the laws of logic do not apply to him, then he could cause himself to not exist. But the concept of God is of a necessary being that cannot fail to exist. So again, we're confronted with an absurdity if God is above reason. Some might say that if God is subject to reason, then he's not the ultimate reality, reason is. But this is to treat reason or logic as a thing independent of God. Rather, we should think of the laws of logic as the way a essentially rational God thinks.
The next question is, what is hindering us to know God in his fullness?
There could be many things. Certainly, there have been people that have never heard of Jesus or the gospel. So they would not be responsible for not having heard those things. But there are other people that have heard of those things and still do not believe. Often they refuse to believe because they don't like what it would mean for their lives. The Bible says that they hated the light and loved the darkness. And so it's not always intellectual, sometimes it's moral. And this is why in evangelism, it's important to address both.
There is another question that popped up also from the same person. Does faith depend on will? Credința depinde de voință? Am mai pus întrebarea Tamașian.
Yeah, here we need to distinguish between belief in and belief that. There are certain things that we can't help believing. It's not affected by our will. But belief that involves an element of trust, which does involve the will. And so when the Bible says that one must have faith, it's speaking both of believing in and believing that. And so it is an aspect of faith that we must will or accept the gift of salvation.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much to be with us tonight. It's a lot of terms that probably were not translated, quite, the way it's supposed to. But
hopefully you can share with them that there's a Romanian translation of On Guard available. It's a really good resource. Yeah.
So thank you so much, and I know what's next for you, and I'm praying for you. God bless you.
Great questions, everyone. Mulțumesc.
Foarte bune. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Mulțumesc, toată lumea. Domnul să vă binecuvinteze. Ne întâlnim data viitoare. Dacă aveți întrebări, știți cum să mă găsiți. Binecuvântarea lui Dumnezeu cu voi.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.